When we talk about stopping the habit of explaining ourselves, we are not talking about arrogance. We are not talking about indifference. We are talking about something far more vulnerable. We are talking about the moment a human being decides that their existence does not require constant justification. Most of us learned very early that love was conditional, that safety depended on how well we could clarify, defend, soften, and reshape ourselves for the comfort of others. So we became translators of our own souls. We over-explained our feelings. We justified our boundaries. We rehearsed our no, as if it were a courtroom defense. And somewhere in that process, we forgot that being is not a crime. Stopping the explanation is not a behavioral shift. It is a nervous system shift. It is what happens when your body is no longer trying to survive rejection. For years, perhaps decades, you may have been driven by an unconscious belief. If they misunderstand me, I will lose connection. If they misinterpret me, I will lose belonging. And because belonging once meant survival, you paid the price. You over-articulated your intentions. You diluted your truth. You carried guilt for simply having needs. But when you stop explaining yourself, something profound begins to happen inside. There is a quiet return to integrity. Not the moral kind, the psychological kind. Integrity is wholeness. You no longer split yourself into acceptable and unacceptable parts. You no longer rush to clarify your tone, your choice, your timing, your boundary. You speak once, and then you allow the silence to exist. This silence can feel terrifying at first, because in that silence there is no control. When you explain, you are attempting to manage perception. You are trying to regulate the other person's response, so you don't have to feel the old wound of misunderstanding. When you stop explaining, you relinquish that control. You allow people to think what they will. And that can awaken the very fear that shaped your childhood, the fear of being misseen and left alone. So the question becomes, why did you feel responsible for being perfectly understood in the first place? Often, chronic explaining is born in environments where your emotional reality was questioned. Maybe you were told you were too sensitive, too dramatic, too selfish. Maybe your no was not respected unless it was wrapped in elaborate reasoning. So you learned that your truth on its own was insufficient. It needed decoration, evidence, apology. You became skilled at intellectualizing your feelings because raw feelings were not safe. When you stop explaining yourself, you stop negotiating your worth. There is grief in this shift, because you begin to see how much energy you spent trying to earn what should have been freely given. Respect, space, basic understanding, and there can be anger too. Not the explosive kind, the quiet recognition that you were bending in rooms where you had every right to stand upright. But something else also happens. Your relationships begin to reorganize. People who relied on your over-explaining may feel unsettled. They may accuse you of being distant, cold, changed. What they are often responding to is the absence of your old compliance. You are no longer performing reassurance at the expense of your nervous system. And here is the paradox: when you stop explaining yourself, you actually become clearer. Clarity does not come from more words. It comes from congruence. When your internal state and your external expression align, there is a steadiness in you. You say, "I'm not available for that." And you do not follow it with a paragraph. You say, "That doesn't work for me." And you let it stand. There is power in that simplicity, but it is not dominance. It is self-trust. Self-trust is the true transformation here, because explaining at its core often hides self-doubt. If I can just phrase this better, maybe they will see that I am reasonable. If I can just justify my boundary enough, maybe they won't leave. But when you trust yourself, you no longer need consensus to validate your inner experience. You can tolerate being misunderstood, and tolerating misunderstanding is a sign of healing. It means your nervous system no longer equates disagreement with abandonment. It means you can survive someone thinking you are wrong. It means you have separated your identity from others' interpretations. This does not mean you stop communicating. It means you stop over-functioning in communication. You share when it feels genuine, not when it feels compelled by fear. You clarify when there is mutual curiosity, not when there is accusation. You no longer argue your humanity into existence. There is also a deeper layer. When you stop explaining yourself, you are forced to confront who you are without external reflection. If you are not constantly adjusting to feedback, you begin to ask, what do I actually believe? What do I actually want? The noise quiets. And in that quiet, authenticity emerges, not as rebellion, but as alignment. You may notice your circle becoming smaller, not because you are rejecting people, but because you are no longer contorting to maintain proximity. The relationships that remain are those that can withstand your boundaries without demanding a thesis statement. And in that space, something tender begins to grow. A sense of internal safety. The understanding that you do not have to overexert yourself to be worthy of staying in the room. You are allowed to take up space without narrating your existence. You are allowed to choose without persuading. You are allowed to rest without defending your fatigue. You are allowed to change without issuing a public announcement. The fear of being misunderstood is rarely about communication. It is almost never about vocabulary, tone, or timing. It is about attachment. It is about what misunderstanding once cost you. For many people, being misunderstood does not simply register as a social inconvenience. It registers in the body as danger. The chest tightens, the stomach drops, the mind begins racing, searching for better phrasing, clearer explanations, softer words. You try again and again, not because you are obsessed with clarity, but because somewhere deep inside, misunderstanding is linked with loss. As children, we depend entirely on the adults around us for survival. Our nervous systems are shaped by how those adults respond to our emotions. If, when we expressed hurt, we were told we were dramatic, we learned that our pain could isolate us. If, when we said no, we were pressured or shamed, we learned that our boundaries threatened connection. If, when we tried to explain ourselves, we were dismissed, mocked, or ignored, we absorbed a powerful message being seen as unsafe. So we adapted. We became vigilant. We studied faces, tones, micro-expressions. We learned to anticipate misunderstanding before it happened. We rehearsed our words. We added disclaimers. We softened our truths with apologies. We tried to manage perception because we believed that if others formed the wrong impression of us, we might lose our place. The child's mind makes a simple equation: misunderstanding leads to disconnection. Disconnection leads to abandonment. Abandonment for a child feels like annihilation. This equation does not disappear in adulthood. It hides beneath our relationships, especially the intimate ones. When someone misinterprets your intention, the reaction may seem disproportionate. You feel an urgent need to correct the narrative. You cannot rest until they get it. It may look like pride. It may look like defensiveness. But often it is fear. The fear is not that they think you are wrong. The fear is that they will withdraw love. When we examine this closely, we see that over-explaining is not about being right. It is about preserving attachment. You are not fighting for intellectual accuracy. You are fighting for connection. You are saying, in essence, please don't leave me because you don't understand me. This is why even small misunderstandings can feel enormous. A partner misreads your tone. A friend assumes bad intent. A colleague questions your decision. And suddenly your body reacts as if something much larger is at stake. The nervous system does not distinguish between present and past. It responds to patterns. If misunderstanding once meant emotional distance, your system prepares for that distance again. In this state, you may find yourself explaining beyond what is necessary. You repeat your reasoning. You add emotional context. You offer evidence of your goodwill. You try to make yourself legible in every possible way. And if the other person still does not understand, the panic can intensify. Underneath that panic is a very old longing to be seen and stay connected at the same time. For some, childhood required a painful choice. You could be authentic, or you could be attached. If expressing your real feelings led to rejection, you learned to adjust. You became who others needed you to be. You filtered your reactions. You translated your emotions into something more digestible. And if you were misunderstood, you worked tirelessly to fix it, because attachment depended on it. But here is the quiet truth in adulthood: misunderstanding does not automatically equal abandonment. That truth can be hard to internalize. Because the body remembers. The body does not respond to logic. It responds to stored experience. So healing begins not with better communication strategies, but with recognizing the old wound that gets activated when you are misinterpreted. When you notice the urgency to correct, you can pause and ask yourself, what am I afraid will happen if they don't understand me? Often the answer is not, they will disagree. It is, they will pull away. And then a deeper question emerges: is that fear rooted in the present or in my past? As you begin to separate the two, something shifts. You start to see that someone's misunderstanding is not necessarily a threat to your existence. It may be uncomfortable. It may require clarification, but it does not define your worth. It does not erase your legitimacy, and it does not automatically dissolve connection. There is a profound maturity in allowing space for others to hold an incomplete picture of you without scrambling to repair it instantly. This does not mean you silence yourself. It means you trust that authentic connection can survive imperfection. Real intimacy is not built on perfect understanding. It is built on resilience, on the capacity to move through moments of misattunement without collapsing into fear. When you no longer equate misunderstanding with abandonment, you gain emotional freedom. You can express yourself once, clearly and calmly, and then allow the other person the dignity of their own perception. And in that space, you begin to discover that the deepest security does not come from being perfectly understood by everyone around you, but from knowing that even if someone fails to see you fully, you are not disappearing, you are not being erased, you are not that child standing alone in a room where your feelings made you unlovable. Silence after a boundary is one of the most revealing moments in any relationship. Not the words you speak, not the reasoning you provide, but what happens after you stop talking. When you say, calmly and clearly, "That doesn't work for me," something shifts in the relational field. You are no longer negotiating your comfort for the sake of harmony. You are no longer cushioning your truth with excessive explanation. You are simply stating a limit. And then there is a pause. That pause is not empty. It is diagnostic. For someone who respects you, silence is space. They may need a moment to process. They may feel disappointment. They may not agree. But they do not rush to dismantle your boundary. They do not immediately question your character. They do not escalate. Their nervous system can tolerate your autonomy. They understand, even if unconsciously, that your no is not a rejection of them. It is an expression of you. But for someone who benefited from your lack of boundaries, that same silence feels threatening. When you stop over-explaining, you also stop over-soothing. In the past, perhaps you would have followed your boundary with reassurance. You would have softened it. "I'm sorry. I just have a lot going on. It's not about you. Maybe another time." You would have managed their reaction to make sure it didn't turn into withdrawal or anger. You carried the emotional labor of making your limits comfortable. Now, when you say less, you remove that buffer. And this is where the truth of the relationship emerges. If the other person responds with guilt, tripping, silent treatment, sarcasm, or exaggerated hurt, you are witnessing something important. Not their pain alone, but their relationship to control. A boundary disrupts control. It introduces unpredictability. It says, "You do not have unlimited access to me." For someone who equates access with security or power, this can feel destabilizing. The silence after your boundary exposes whether they see you as an autonomous being or as a resource. Do they lean into curiosity? Do they ask gently, "Can you help me understand?" Or do they move into accusation? "You've changed. You're being selfish. Why are you making this such a big deal?" Silence is difficult because it forces both parties to confront their internal reactions. Without your excessive explanation filling the space, the other person must sit with their feelings. They cannot rely on you to immediately regulate them. And you, too, must sit with the discomfort of not rushing in to fix the tension. For many people, this is the hardest part of healing. Not setting the boundary, but tolerating the emotional atmosphere that follows. If you grew up in an environment where tension led to chaos, you likely developed a reflex to resolve it quickly. You smoothed things over. You apologized first. You compromised prematurely. Silence meant danger, so you filled it. Now, when you allow silence to exist after stating your limit, your body may react with anxiety. You may feel an urge to send another message, to clarify further, to reassure. But if you can remain present in that space, you begin to reclaim something vital, your right to take up space without performing comfort. Respect reveals itself in how someone handles your no when you are not bending to make it easier for them. Mature respect does not require you to shrink your boundary. It does not demand a dissertation. It does not punish you with distance. It acknowledges that two people can remain connected even when one says no. There is a profound shift that happens when you witness this clearly. You stop guessing who respects you. You stop relying solely on words of affirmation. You observe behavior. You notice patterns. You see who honors your limits even when it inconveniences them. And equally, you see who resents your autonomy. This clarity can be painful, because sometimes the people who react poorly are those you hoped would respond differently. But it is also liberating. The silence after a boundary becomes a teacher. It shows you the emotional maturity of the relationship without argument. You begin to understand that respect is not proven when you are agreeable. It is proven when you are self-defining. And as you grow more comfortable with that silence, something else shifts internally. You realize that you do not need immediate reassurance to feel secure. You do not need instant harmony to feel safe. You can withstand temporary discomfort without abandoning yourself. In that space, your boundaries become less about controlling others and more about honoring your nervous system. They are no longer weapons or walls. They are expressions of self, trust. And the people who are capable of real connection will adapt, not because they are perfect, but because they value the relationship more than their entitlement to your compliance. Silence, then, is not emptiness, it is revelation. It reveals who can sit with your autonomy without trying to override it. It reveals who confuses love with access. It reveals whether the bond between you is built on mutual respect or on your quiet self-erasure. Letting people misinterpret you feels, at first, like a violation. There is a reflex that rises almost immediately. Correct it. Clarify it. Fix the distortion before it spreads. Because to be misinterpreted can feel like being rewritten without consent. But emotional maturity is not the ability to control how you are perceived. It is the capacity to remain grounded even when you are perceived inaccurately. When someone misreads your intention, something in you may contract. The body remembers earlier moments in life when being misunderstood had consequences. Perhaps you were labeled difficult when you were overwhelmed. Perhaps you were called selfish when you were trying to protect yourself. Those early misinterpretations were not harmless. They shaped how others treated you. They may have influenced how much love or approval you received, so of course the impulse to correct is strong. The child inside you learned that if the narrative is wrong, your safety is at risk. But adulthood offers a different possibility. Not everyone's misunderstanding carries the same weight. Not every inaccurate perception requires a campaign of correction. Emotional maturity involves discerning the difference between meaningful misattunement and ego discomfort. There is a subtle but profound shift when you no longer feel compelled to manage every narrative about you. You begin to accept that other people see you through the lens of their own wounds, expectations, and projections. Their interpretation says as much about their internal world as it does about your behavior. This does not mean you become passive. It does not mean you allow false accusations to define you in situations that genuinely matter. But it does mean you recognize that clarity does not guarantee agreement. You can explain yourself perfectly and still be misunderstood. And at some point, continuing to explain becomes less about communication and more about soothing your own anxiety. Letting someone misinterpret you can feel like surrendering control, because in many ways it is. You are surrendering the illusion that you can shape how everyone holds you in their mind. That illusion is seductive. It promises security. If they just see me correctly, everything will be fine. But everything is not dependent on being seen correctly by everyone. Emotional maturity is the ability to tolerate being partially known, to accept that no one, no matter how close, will hold a complete and flawless understanding of you. You are too complex for that, and so are they. When you allow someone to misunderstand you without scrambling to correct them immediately, you are practicing internal anchoring. You are saying, even if silently, I know my intention, I know my truth. Their perception does not erase that. This anchoring reduces reactivity. Instead of rushing into defense mode, you pause, you assess. Is this relationship one where mutual understanding is possible? Is the other person genuinely curious, or are they committed to their version of events? If curiosity is present, a calm clarification can be offered. If it is absent, no amount of explanation will shift the narrative. There is also a deeper layer. Sometimes our urgency to correct comes from pride rather than fear. We want to be seen as good, as reasonable, as kind. We want our self-image reflected back accurately. When that reflection is distorted, it challenges our identity. Emotional maturity invites us to loosen our grip on that image, to recognize that we can remain intact even if someone sees us as flawed. In fact, part of growth involves being willing to be disliked or misjudged for living in alignment with ourselves. This is particularly true when you begin setting boundaries. People who were comfortable with your compliance may interpret your new firmness as hostility. They may call you cold when you are simply clear. They may label you distant when you are protecting your energy. You can spend endless hours trying to convince them otherwise. Or you can accept that their interpretation serves a function in their own narrative. Letting them hold that narrative does not mean you agree with it. It means you are no longer sacrificing your peace to dismantle it. There is strength in this restraint, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that does not need applause or validation. You speak when necessary. You clarify when it feels grounded. But you do not chase every misconception like a fire that must be extinguished. Over time, this changes your internal landscape. You feel less fragile in the face of opinion, less dependent on external accuracy, more rooted in self-awareness. You begin to understand that your identity is not a public referendum, and something softens. You allow others the freedom to misunderstand you just as you allow yourself the freedom to misunderstand them at times. Relationships become less about perfect attunement and more about resilience, less about constant correction and more about mutual respect. Letting people misinterpret you, when it is safe to do so, is not weakness. It is a sign that you trust yourself enough to withstand incomplete perception. It is the quiet confidence that your truth does not evaporate simply because someone else cannot see it clearly. When you stop justifying yourself, manipulation begins to lose its oxygen. Manipulation thrives in explanation. It feeds on your need to be understood, on your desire to appear reasonable, on your fear of being seen as wrong. It waits for you to open the door with an over-detailed defense, and then it steps inside, rearranging the narrative until you are the one apologizing for your own boundary. If you look closely at many manipulative dynamics, you will notice a pattern. You state a need or a limit. The other person does not respond to the limit itself. Instead, they question your reasoning. Why do you feel that way? That doesn't make sense. After everything I've done. Suddenly the conversation is no longer about your boundary. It is about whether your boundary is valid. And the moment you begin to justify, the power shifts. Now you are on trial. You are presenting evidence. You are defending your emotional reality as if it requires cross-examination. The manipulative dynamic depends on this shift. Because if your feelings can be debated, they can be dismantled. If your boundary must be logically airtight, any small inconsistency can be used to weaken it. But a boundary does not need to win an argument in order to be legitimate. When you stop explaining beyond what is necessary, you interrupt this cycle. You say, "This doesn't work for me." And when they push, you do not escalate into a dissertation. You repeat calmly, "It still doesn't work for me." There is very little for manipulation to grip onto in that simplicity. Manipulation often relies on emotional hooks: guilt, shame, fear. You're hurting me. You're being selfish. If you cared, you would. These statements are invitations to abandon your position in order to restore harmony. If your nervous system is trained to equate harmony with safety, you may feel a powerful urge to comply. Justifying becomes a way to reduce the discomfort. You try to prove that you are not selfish. You try to show that you do care. You offer context, history, sacrifice. But the manipulative dynamic is not seeking understanding. It is seeking control. No amount of explanation will satisfy a need that is rooted in entitlement. When you stop justifying, you are not becoming cold. You are becoming cleared. Clarity disrupts manipulation because it removes negotiation from places where negotiation is inappropriate. Your feelings are not a debate club topic. Your limits are not community property. When you trust that your internal experience is valid without external approval, you become less susceptible to being talked out of it. There is also a deeper psychological shift that occurs. When you no longer feel compelled to defend every decision, you reclaim authority over your inner world. Manipulation often works by creating doubt. Are you sure you're not overreacting? Is that really what happened? This subtle erosion of self-trust can accumulate over time, especially in close relationships. If you respond to every instance of doubt with over-explanation, you may inadvertently reinforce the idea that your perception requires validation. But when you calmly stand by your experience without excessive elaboration, you strengthen your internal anchor. You send a message to yourself: I do not need to persuade someone in order to honor what I feel. This does not mean you never explain. Healthy relationships involve dialogue, empathy, mutual understanding. But explanation offered freely is different from justification extracted under pressure. One comes from connection. The other comes from fear. When manipulation loses its grip, something else emerges: accountability. In the absence of your defensive monologues, the other person is left with their own reaction. They can no longer redirect the focus entirely onto your reasoning. They must confront their disappointment, their frustration, or their unmet expectation without turning it into a courtroom drama. Not everyone will welcome this shift. Some may escalate their tactics. They may become louder, more dramatic, more insistent. This can feel destabilizing at first, because the old dynamic, however unhealthy, was familiar. You knew your role in it. You explained. They questioned. You defended. They pressured. And eventually you compromised. Breaking that pattern can create temporary turbulence. But turbulence is not the same as danger. Over time, as you remain steady, the manipulative strategies lose effectiveness. Guilt does not move you as easily. Accusations do not unravel you as quickly. You listen, you assess, but you do not collapse. You begin to see that manipulation requires participation. It requires your willingness to doubt yourself enough to argue your own humanity. When you withdraw that participation, the dynamic cannot function in the same way. And in that space, you experience something deeply stabilizing, the realization that your peace does not depend on winning arguments, proving innocence, or exhausting yourself in endless clarification. It depends on staying aligned with your own truth, even when someone else resists it. Your nervous system has been working very hard for a very long time. If you have lived in a state of chronic explaining, chronic defending, chronic clarifying, then your body has likely been living in subtle survival mode. Not dramatic survival, not visible crisis, but the quiet, persistent vigilance of someone who feels they must constantly manage how they are perceived in order to stay connected. When you are always explaining yourself, your nervous system is scanning for threat. It is asking, did that land wrong? Are they upset? Do I need to fix this? This scanning is not random, it is patterned. It is the residue of earlier experiences where emotional missteps had consequences. Perhaps in your childhood home, moods shifted quickly. Perhaps love felt conditional on behavior. Perhaps silence meant anger. You learned to read the room with extraordinary precision. You learned that staying safe meant anticipating misunderstanding before it hardened into rejection. That hyper-attunement is not a flaw. It is an adaptation. But adaptations that once protected you can become exhausting when they are no longer necessary. Every time you over-explain, your body mobilizes. There is a subtle spike of adrenaline, a tightening in the chest, a quickening of thought. You are preparing to defend your position, to secure your belonging. Even if the conversation is mild, your physiology may react as if something significant is at stake. Over time, this creates chronic tension. You may not label it as anxiety. It may simply feel like mental overactivity. Difficulty relaxing, replaying conversations long after they end. Thinking of better ways you could have phrased something. Imagining how someone might have misinterpreted you. This is not overthinking in isolation. It is a nervous system that does not fully trust that connection can survive imperfection. When you stop performing for acceptance, something shifts at the level of the body. Performance requires energy. It requires monitoring. It requires editing yourself in real time. When you decide consciously that you will no longer over-function in conversations, you are signaling to your nervous system that the threat level is lower than it once was. At first, this may not feel calming. It may feel uncomfortable, even unsafe, because your system is used to equating hyper-engagement with protection. If you are not actively managing the interaction, who will? If you are not smoothing the tension, what will happen? This is where healing becomes embodied. You stay present in the discomfort. You say what you need to say once, and then you allow the space. Your heart may race. Your mind may urge you to send another message, to clarify further, to add reassurance. But if you can pause, breathe, and remain grounded, you begin to teach your body a new lesson. The lesson is this: I can survive without overperforming. As this pattern repeats, the nervous system recalibrates. It learns that silence after a boundary does not automatically lead to catastrophe. It learns that disagreement does not equal abandonment. It learns that someone else's disappointment is not your emergency. And gradually, there is more space inside you. You may notice that you feel less drained after social interactions, less compelled to replay every detail. You may find that your shoulders are not perpetually tense, that you can move through conversations without the constant undercurrent of self-monitoring. This calm is not indifference. It is regulation. Regulation means your internal state is not entirely dictated by external reactions. You can hear criticism without spiraling into shame. You can sense misunderstanding without launching into defense mode. You can tolerate someone's silence without filling it reflexively. There is also a profound shift in authenticity. When you are not performing for acceptance, your responses become simpler, cleaner. You are not calculating how to be perceived. You are responding from alignment. This reduces cognitive load, it reduces internal conflict, and that reduction has physiological consequences. The body feels safer when it does not have to fragment itself. Fragmentation occurs when part of you feels one thing, but another part edits it for approval. That split requires energy. When you close that gap, when what you feel and what you express are more congruent, the nervous system experiences coherence. Coherence is calming. Over time, this coherence becomes your baseline. You no longer live in constant anticipation of correction. You trust that you can handle whatever arises without abandoning yourself. That trust quiets the vigilance. And perhaps most importantly, you begin to experience connection differently. Not as something that must be earned through constant adjustment, but as something that can exist alongside your boundaries, your preferences, your limits. The body relaxes when it realizes it does not have to audition for belonging. In that relaxation, you rediscover a steadiness that was always there beneath the performance. A steadiness that does not require you to prove, persuade, or protect your existence in every exchange. A steadiness that allows you to be present rather than perpetually prepared. Authenticity does not begin with bold declarations. It begins with permission. And for many of us, the need for permission has been so deeply woven into our identity that we mistake it for humility, for politeness, for being considerate. From an early age, you may have learned to look outward before looking inward. Is this acceptable? Will this upset someone? Am I allowed to feel this way? The impulse to seek approval before taking up space can become automatic. You do not even notice that you are waiting for a green light from the outside world before honoring something within you. Releasing the need for permission is not rebellion. It is integration. When you constantly look to others to validate your choices, your preferences, your emotions, you fragment yourself. One part of you feels the impulse. Another part scans the environment for approval. A third part edits the impulse to make it more digestible. By the time you act, the original truth has been diluted. Authenticity deepens when that internal negotiation quiets. You begin to notice how often you soften your desires. How often you preface your opinions with disclaimers. This might sound silly, but I don't know if this makes sense. These phrases are not accidental. They are protective. They are attempts to cushion your self-expression in case it is rejected. But every disclaimer carries a subtle message to yourself. My voice needs to be reduced to be acceptable. When you release the need for permission, you stop pre-apologizing for your existence. You say what you think without rehearsing it for universal approval. You make decisions without assembling a committee. You allow your preferences to stand, even if they do not align with someone else's expectations. This does not mean you become rigid or dismissive of others. It means your center of gravity shifts inward. For people who grew up in environments where autonomy was discouraged, this shift can feel disorienting. Perhaps you were praised for being agreeable. Perhaps conflict was avoided at all costs. Perhaps asserting yourself led to withdrawal of affection. In such environments, authenticity was risky. Permission was survival, so of course you learned to seek it. But adulthood invites a different posture. You are no longer entirely dependent on the emotional climate of a single room. You have more agency, more capacity, more resilience. And yet, the old pattern may persist. You may still feel a flicker of guilt when you choose something that others do not fully endorse. That guilt is not proof that you are wrong. It is often proof that you are stepping outside an old conditioning. Authenticity deepens when you tolerate that discomfort instead of retreating from it. When you choose the restaurant you actually prefer without deferring automatically. When you express an unpopular opinion without shrinking. When you decline an invitation without constructing an elaborate justification. Each small act of self-trust strengthens your internal foundation. Over time, you begin to recognize that permission was never something others were truly qualified to grant. They can offer input. They can offer perspective, but they cannot authorize your inner life. Your feelings do not require consensus to be valid. Your preferences do not need majority vote. As you internalize this, your expression becomes more fluid, less performative. You are not shaping yourself to fit every audience. You are allowing yourself to be consistent across contexts. That consistency is what gives authenticity its depth. It is not loud. It is steady. There is also a paradox here. When you stop seeking permission, you often become more open to genuine feedback. Because feedback no longer threatens your core. If your sense of self is not hanging on external approval, you can listen without collapsing. You can adjust without feeling erased. Authenticity is not stubbornness, it is rootedness. Releasing the need for permission also alters your relationships. People who were accustomed to deciding for you may feel unsettled. They may interpret your autonomy as distance. But over time, healthier dynamics emerge. You are no longer entering connection from a place of self-abandonment. You are entering as a whole person. And that wholeness changes the quality of intimacy. You are not asking to be chosen at the expense of yourself. You are choosing while staying connected to yourself. You are not shrinking to maintain closeness. You are expanding and allowing those who resonate to remain. Authenticity, then, is not a performance of boldness. It is the quiet refusal to seek approval for being who you already are. It is the gradual shedding of the belief that your inner world must be cleared by someone else before it can be expressed. And as that belief dissolves, what remains is a more integrated, more grounded, more honest version of you, one that does not wait to be authorized before it speaks, chooses, feels, or simply exists.